Podcasts are all the rage right now, but how do you know that a podcast is actually going to build your business versus a personal brand or an influencer brand, for example? There are some very specific goals that you need to have in mind, specific metrics you want to be tracking, and you can have a really successful high ROI podcast for a product or service-based business. You just have to have this information planned out in the back of your head and in your strategy. And there's no better person to learn all of this from than the incredible Berta Wired, who is the person we're going to be talking to today. So join me in just a second. Hi, Berta. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Emma, for having me here.
And I pronounce her name Berta because I also speak Spanish, which is Berta's first language, but you can also say Berta. I think you let all your English-speaking clients call you Berta, right?
I think mostly call me more like Burra, or I don't really know how
Burra?
to pronounce it. Yeah, sometimes, well, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's like hard to pronounce exactly how they say it, but I feel like the T, it's less pronounced, or the R. I don't exactly know.
Could be more like Berta, like with a
Yeah.
D sound almost.
Yeah,
that seems
something like
very
that.
North American. But this is Berta Wired. So Berta is my podcast editor, producer, YouTube editor, producer, all of those things. So I thought it made a ton of sense to invite Berta onto our YouTube video / podcast today, because you'll find this in both formats. So basically, let's start with telling us a little bit about you, Berta. Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Berta Wired, as you just said, and I help entrepreneurs and small business owners to launch their podcasts and increase brand visibility through this marketing tool, this awesome marketing tool. And that's kind of like basically what I do, like in big words, but then there's like a lot more into it, as I guess you could also agree, kind of like the strategy part. And if they don't already have a podcast, I can help them launch it. And then the monthly management. And also, I keep forgetting this new service, but I can also help people launching their podcast and helping them do it themselves. So it's kind of like a DIY with the strategy sessions, if that makes sense.
It's super unique. So someone who's trying to keep it cost effective and get it done right at the same time has your support, has your system, but is able to DIY it. That's the Wired method, right?
Yeah, that's the Wire method. Exactly.
Amazing. Awesome. So Berta, how did you first get into entrepreneurship? I love your story. So tell me about it. Tell our whole audience about it.
Well, it's kind of like a long story. I'll try to make it short. So I've been traveling. Well, I was traveling because I'm not traveling anymore at the moment for like 8 years. And then at some point, like doing like random things. And at some point, I was like, well, I want to do something that allows me to keep traveling, but like more, not just being in one place. So I found a job, but it was in the sales and customer service role. And I stayed there for like 2.5 years. And then I was like, well, this is not really for me. I want to do something that is more impactful and that I like more, let's say. So I started looking what I could do, and a good friend of mine told me about being a VA that I didn't even know what that was at the moment. So I enrolled in a course, learned a bunch of things different from Pinterest, video, podcast, social media, blog posts, everything that you can offer online, basically. And I just fell in love with podcasts. So I started, as you know, as a Pinterest manager as well, and offering as well content repurposing, video, and podcasts. But because I was afraid to niche down, maybe, and also because I like them all. So it was really hard for me to decide just to do one thing. But as I was doing more work and having more clients, I kind of knew that podcast was what I liked the most. I also love video editing, but I wouldn't say like, okay, I'm like the full strategist in YouTube or like any other platform as I would say I can be for podcasts. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
Amazing. And just to be super clear, VA, that first step is virtual assistant. Then you moved into Pinterest and podcasts and content repurposing together. And now podcast producer, strategist, editor, manager. You do all the things. You're
Exactly.
our absolute head of all this. And in this case, we start with the YouTube video. So we have our YouTube strategy. I record pretty much everything as video format, and then Berta repurposes them into the podcast. And so that was super helpful too, that we already had started that. And so you were able to draw from our library of YouTube videos and recommend this video would do really well in a podcast only format. And you were able to basically draw from that content to create our first several weeks worth of podcast episodes. And now we're synced up. So every Thursday, a new video goes out. Every Monday, the podcast version goes out. Was that an easy process? Was it easier starting that way than launching from scratch?
Um, well, I guess in some way because the content was already there. But for me, when I launch a podcast for a client, like they have to record the content anyway. That's not something that I do. I do kind of like everything else, but I can do the recording. So if I ask them, okay, I need like 3 episodes from you, once they've recorded the episodes, they give them to me and then I'll edit them. Kind of like as I did with you. It's just that you didn't have to do that step.
So I guess it was easier for me in the end.
Yeah, I would say it was easier for you. And certain things, because we were taking it from YouTube, certain things maybe they were the same, so we didn't have to think them as much or just like getting the idea. But yeah, I would say it was more like it was easier for you.
But that's a great piece of advice. If you're the content creator, if you're the business owner, think about your hero platform. So for us, we almost always start with YouTube, and then we repurpose to other channels, whether it's, the blog, the podcast version, Instagram posts. So if this is something that's interesting to you beyond just podcasts themselves, it might be worthwhile to consider always recording your podcast as a video too. Just a little kind of added tip, something to consider. So more important question to start with is, Berta, how do you decide, or how do you recommend a business owner decides whether their business would benefit from a podcast?
Well, I would say any business provider, service provider would benefit from it. And if you are product based, I guess it depends what type of podcast you do. But if you're a service provider, I think you can always use podcasts because any type of other content that you create, I think you can transform it into podcasts because it's just talking, right? If we talk in video and reels, stories on Instagram, or like we do kind of like live as well, at the end of the day, you're talking. So I think that content can be always done on a podcast format. And because we can do 5 minutes or 1 hour, you decide. Like, do you want to do just like really short episodes? So it's like to the point. So you can do a video on Instagram, but you can also do a podcast episode that is really short and sweet. Or if you want to do an
Excellent.
interview, as we are doing, well, you have a longer format. So I think kind of like everybody can do a podcast.
Amazing. So for the product-based business owner, can you think of an example of when it might make sense to have a podcast for a product? Are there particular types of products? Is it depending on your goals that a podcast could support it? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it depends as well how big is your business or what exactly you do. Because I'm thinking right now, if you are selling wine, but you are an expert as well in how like everything wine related, you could speak like lots of things about wine and
Mm-hmm.
then talk about your products. But if you are going to only maybe talk about like your new wine and why it's like amazing, that's okay. Maybe you run out of topics. But if you're an expert like in the wine industry and then you can help in other ways, or maybe you have guests on your podcast, I think there is like a lot of possibilities into it as well. Or like, I don't know, you sell skincare products. You can talk about how to take care of your skin, how to do when summer is arriving, like lots of things, not just your product. But if maybe you're only like selling and you're like in between the person that creates the product and maybe you
Yeah.
don't have that knowledge. So I would say like it depends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the theme that I hear in common, whether it's service or product based, is that in some way, if you position yourself as an expert or if you have education to provide,
Hmm.
then you're really well positioned to benefit from a podcast. Would you say that that's kind of a good summary on both sides?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I would say. Yeah.
amazing. Hey, just popping in here to say welcome if you've never been to my channel before. This is not my typical setup, but it's working for today. And I want to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation with Berta Wired. My name's Emma Gibbons. I am the founder of Emma Gibbons Content and Copy, which is a branded copywriting and content marketing boutique based here in Toronto. Of course, Berta is one of our team members and she is absolutely abroad. But we typically focus on serving premium service based and high end product based businesses. And we have tons of conversations here on YouTube about branded copy and content. So if those are interesting topics to you, and if you're loving this conversation we're having with Berta today, then please consider subscribing. There's that little subscribe button just down below and a notification bell that will make sure you never miss an episode. We have new episodes typically every Thursday. And I'll leave it at that. Let's head back over to the conversation with Berta. Speaking of the format as well, with service-based business owners, you're mentioning it could be 5 minutes. Like if you can fill out a 5-minute live on Instagram, you could definitely do an audio like podcast, or it could be a whole hour for an interview. So how does someone decide what format? What kind of process did you usually take people through to make that decision?
But for me, the first step is like, what do you like doing the most? Because for me as well, podcast is about having fun. If you start doing this or start using this marketing tool, if you don't have fun with it, and I don't think it's going to work. So, do you like, or do you have time to do interviews? Do you like just talking to yourself because it's quick and fast and you have all the knowledge? Well, then go for that. So, a lot of people do a mix because they have a lot of knowledge to share, but at the same time, they want to bring over experts. So, they give that value as well to their audience. But there is no like right or wrong. So, I would say, what do you like? How much time do you have? Like, because it takes time. And, I mean, you start with YouTube, but it takes time to think about the topics, like to create the outline, to record. So if you only have, I don't know, an hour per week, maybe just go for like 10 minutes per episode. So then you have time in that whole hour to think about everything and to record the 10 minutes. But if you think that you have more time to dedicate to the podcast, maybe you can go for longer episodes. So it's like what you like, how much time you have, and also consider your marketing strategy in a whole, because it's not only podcasts, right? It's repurposing or maybe using Instagram or TikTok or Pinterest. So yeah, that's what I would like start thinking about when you want to include podcasts in your marketing strategy.
Definitely. And I think also starting with less but high quality is another good way to go, where maybe you only release once a week and it's just a 10-minute episode versus trying to go all out and do like 2 episodes a week or like an hour long each time. And I think that's way more likely to burn out and it's better to build up. And, as the podcast starts to show that it's worthwhile, as you start to earn from your podcast in various ways, maybe that's a good time to put more effort into it. But to start a little bit slower, a little bit more focused on quality. Yeah. Do you think that? Because I mean, I'm not the
Yeah.
expert you are. So do you think that's a good
Yeah,
way of
no,
doing it?
and even less. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday. Yeah, I had a discovery call, and this lady has already a podcast, but in Spanish, and she wants to
Mm-hmm.
launch one in English. And because it's kind of like doubling up the work, she was like, okay, I don't want to get overwhelmed. I already know how much work it takes. So I was like, why don't you start with like two a month, one every other week? And then as you grow and you see like you can like add that into a schedule, maybe we can do once per per week. I was going to say once per month. And then, so then we are thinking about doing that. So
Yeah.
it's not really like you have to start once per week. That's like the most common, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But you can start with less and see how it goes. If you think like once a week is too much, then like you make the rules. So it's like if you
Definitely.
think of Instagram, okay, do we have to post 3 times per week? No, it's better seven. Probably maybe it's better seven, but can you handle 7 times per week? Maybe two. Maybe it's better to have 2 times per week than nothing. So
Definitely. I think in general, as a content marketing principle, quality and consistency are far more important than frequency because, like you said, it might be the difference between posting, you might think 7 times a week, but because you burn out or you run out of ideas, it ends up being 0 for the next 3 weeks. I have done that myself, even though I
Yeah.
know better. And if you had just done 2 well thought out strategic posts the whole time per week, you probably wouldn't have those burnout seasons. So I think it's a good principle overall, and it definitely shows up in podcasting. We see a lot of podcast drop off super, super early into their existence. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and especially in podcasts because we tend to listen to our favorite podcast that maybe the same day of the week or maybe at the same time when we are dropping our kid to school or when we are going to the gym. So if we are not consistent, you can lose your listeners in the way because then they forget about you. So
Mhm.
especially in podcasting, I wouldn't say it's like really important to post every single Wednesday on Instagram. Like nobody's waiting for your post on a Wednesday. But if you are used to releasing new episodes on Wednesday and then you start skipping and then doing Friday and then Monday, probably you're going to lose listeners on the way. So I would say that's really important to stay consistent. Of course, life happens. Of course, sometimes we can do something different, but like try to stick to your day of the week.
Such good advice. And we kind of touched on the idea of your podcast gaining traction and being able to show that it's been worthwhile. So, for a business owner, how do you measure the return on investment of a podcast? And I think our minds first go to monetizing, podcasts that have ad sponsors. But I think the goals are quite different with a business if you're doing this on behalf of your business. So, tell us more about how we can decide how we can measure the ROI on our podcasts.
We've already talked about this a few times. And yeah, a lot of people think, okay, how do I monetize? I always start saying, do you monetize a blog post from for day one, a YouTube channel? I think the answer is no to everybody. And unless you have a really, really big audience, it's going to take time because every marketing tool takes time, like to start seeing some kind of benefits, right? So it's to start giving value to your audience, putting yourself out there as an expert, and then you can create your own ads on your podcast. You can talk about your services that a lot of people forget and they just like maybe invite guests and it's like, okay, what do you offer? But they never talk about their offers. So that's like the first place. And when people listen to an episode, the retention is really, really high compared to videos or maybe lives or maybe reading a blog post. So a lot of people, because they ended up listening to the whole, like you get more like the no like trust factor faster
Mhm.
than in other channels. And as well, many people, because they have that trust, end up buying or following that other person or getting to their website right after they've listened to the episode because you are giving a lot of value. They listen to you like maybe for 30 minutes and it's like, yes, I want this. So a way to measure that is like if you create specific links for your newsletter or a special code that you have and put it in the show notes, then you can track that and see how it's going. And also, you can include the episodes and a lot of the part of the show notes into a newsletter and maybe track from the newsletter as well. Okay, so are people like clicking here and like listening to me? So I think at the beginning it's harder to know, but as soon as you grow and start having like more feedback from your listeners, because they like as well, like maybe to come to you and say like, hey, yeah, I would love to hear about this topic. And I think there is more interaction within the podcast industry than with other platforms, especially if you ask for it, right? So what I tell all of my clients at the beginning before they launch is like, okay, what's your main goal? Is it monetizing? Is it growing your audience? What is it? And then we can measure as well if we are doing it right or if we have to pivot or like take a different approach. But with time,
Amazing.
like maybe 6 months, a year time.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I think oftentimes when people think of podcasting, they want quick wins, which I find a little bit frustrating as a content marketer myself because we don't necessarily expect quick wins from blog posts, like you were saying. Social media can take a really long time to start to take people off of that platform onto actually knowing that, yes, this led to a client. But people are very, they don't have the same amount of patience, I think, for podcasts, which like you were saying, it's so worthwhile because that retention is high, because they're going to hear everything that you have to share, because they show up every single week at the same time. They become really loyal. They develop a parasocial relationship with you, just like you feel super attached to a famous person, and you could feel like, you recognize them on the street, you know them in a sense. They feel the same way about you as the business owner. They start to see you as the expert. You're the person who they think of first when they have an issue that they want to solve. So I think that tip about just having that patience to start with is so true in content marketing across the board. And that does apply to podcasts too. But podcasts are totally worthwhile. So something to keep in mind is that we do minimum 3-month cycles with content marketing in general. But for most things, you're looking at the timeline that Berta shared, 6 to 12 months. Like SEO, for example, you're really ultimately waiting between 6 to 12 months to see what you do right now from an SEO perspective on your blog to start to really show you results on Google. And everybody knows that SEO is worthwhile. So you just have to think of it the same way. It's that long game, but it creates that stability and consistency in your business, that brand awareness that gives you more opportunities to then directly start to make money from bringing in clients, selling products, and more. So that's just my 2 cents thrown in there.
No, but you're totally right. I mean, but yeah, I don't really know why people have that thinking about podcasts. And the other thing that you were saying at the beginning is that you've seen a lot of podcasts like dropping off like really quick. And I think it's
Yeah.
because they underestimate the time that it takes to run a podcast. They think it's just okay, I just get on a mic, I record for a bit, and then it's done. And there's a lot more into it than just recording, especially if you want to have like a professional podcast that sounds good, that is well done. And I've seen so many podcasts with 3 episodes or maybe 10. So most of the new podcasts don't go over the 7th or 10th episode. So that's what it's called, Podfade. There is even a
Yeah.
name, Podfade.
Yeah.
So we don't want to have that, and that's why the strategy part before launching is so important.
Amazing. You're completely right about that. So, Berta, there's so much more we could talk about, but I know that people will have specific questions about their business and how that would work with the podcast. So, how does someone find Berta Wired? How do we get a hold of you?
Well, you can find me everywhere as Berta Wired on Instagram or TikTok whenever I start really using it, but I'm there.
Yeah.
And then LinkedIn, I think you can find me as Berta Wire, if not Berta Wire product podcasting. Because I think that I have tutorials. But if you type on LinkedIn Berta Wire, you'll find me, and my website as well. So pretty much everywhere. But then we'll link those in the show notes or in the
Yeah.
description in the podcast, so you'll have them handy.
Amazing. And just before we go, so that people have a sense of some of the different industries you work with, can you share with us a couple of the podcasts that you work on behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, I work for Emma Gibbons Content and Copy.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple of clients that have a marketing podcast or that they talk as well about entrepreneurship. And one is about health and fitness. And other ones is about travel. So, I mean, I think I work in different industries, but the common theme I would say is there are small business owners and pretty much women, but it just I don't have anything against men, but
It
it's
just kind of turned out that way, right?
yeah, it just kind
Yeah.
of turned out that way. And yeah, people that want to use their podcast to grow their audience and have more visibility and share their
Amazing.
message as well, because it's yeah, that's how they help others, right? I feel this medium, I don't know, I just feel it's so personal. Maybe it's just because they have you in your ears. And then it's like
Hmm.
just like closer than any other medium.
Definitely. I totally agree with you on that. Amazing. So definitely reach out to Berta. She is the expert in all things podcasting, whether you already have one or you are looking to launch one and you want some advice, DIY or done for you. She does it all. She's super, super talented. So make sure that you follow her. Berta, thank you so much for joining us today. I've loved spending this time with you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for having me. This was so much fun, and I'll have even more fun when I have to edit myself.
Yes, that's true. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Emma Given's Content and Copy. I'd love to hear what surprised you about Berta's advice. Have you considered the very strategic approach you need to have to launching a podcast for a business? Let me know in the comments down below. If you have time to stick around, there's going to be some video suggestions on the screen right now for you to keep learning about branded copy and content. Otherwise, I will see you next Thursday. Make sure you've hit the like button before you head off, and take care.